So in about a week now, we are lucky enough to be getting the Battlefront Classic Collection. I'm so excited to play an old school classic again, and today I wanted to essentially compare the old Battlefront 2 from 2005 to the EA Battlefront 2 from 2017, and sort of showcase and point out all of the key differences between the two, because I know a lot of people who might play the Classic Collection that have actually never played the old school Battlefront games, and not only will it be a good way for those guys to kind of just know what to expect, but even for the rest of us, it will be a good little refresher on all the key differences between the two games. Now, like I said, I'm mostly comparing Battlefront 2 from 2005 rather than really talking about 2004, simply because I do think the Classic Collection will sort of form itself more around 2005, simply because there's the heroes and stuff like that. So I feel like it's going to have more of the gameplay of 2005, while still obviously having all the content and stuff from 2004 as well. So I just thought I'd throw that in there. I will touch on Battlefront 2004 a few times here and there, but for the most part, in terms of gameplay and stuff, I'm only really referring to Battlefront 2 2005. Now, I've broken this down into about 5 different sections, those being the graphics, the maps, the classes, the heroes, and then the game modes as well. And we're going to start off with the graphics. Now, this kind of goes without saying, but it is a completely unfair comparison. Battlefront 2017 is not only much newer, it is obviously 12 years newer, but I still also stand by the fact that this is honestly one of the best looking games of all time. I know that might just sound biased because I'm a big Battlefront fan. Go and find me 10 games that have been made that look better than Battlefront 2017. I really genuinely think this is one of the top 5 or 10 best looking games ever made. Even though it is nearly 7 years old, I still don't think that many games that have come out in the last few years have looked all that much better. The only ones that really come to mind are games like maybe God of War Ragnarok, for example. Games of that caliber definitely look better, but I genuinely don't think there's more than like 10 of those sorts of games that look better than Battlefront 2. Now, with that being said, even though it is an unfair comparison, Battlefront 2005 and 2004 for that matter actually looked insane for the time period that they launched in. I know a lot of you guys may be younger, but anyone who's my age can probably remember back to those times when video games were so much more basic and just like very surface level compared to what we have now. It was a completely different time back then. And I do genuinely think that the graphics for the original Battlefront games are actually really good for their time. Now, obviously, looking at them now, it's hard to see how we could ever think those graphics were good, because they're simply not when you compare them to current day. But I just wanted to throw that in there, that I do think for the time, these Battlefront games actually did have really solid graphics. To add on to that too, I actually remember reading that on the Death Star on Battlefront 2005, they actually duplicated every item on the floor, including actual player models and stuff like that, flipped them upside down, and then the floor was actually sort of slightly transparent, and that created a reflection on the floor. So it looked like the floor was like shiny, like we know the Death Star is, even though there was no such thing as like ray tracing or anything like that back then, at least not that those consoles were actually capable of doing. So that's an example of how the game did actually look really good. There was reflections on the floor and all that kind of stuff, which for, 2004 and 2005 is pretty absurd. That was something that was like kind of groundbreaking at the time. Now, moving on to the map side of things, both games, in my opinion, have absolutely phenomenal maps. They're all probably some of my favorite maps across any shooters that I've ever played, to be honest. And while I do love the Battlefront 2017 maps and also the 2015 ones for that matter too, I do genuinely think that the old school maps are actually better, at least in terms of just the layout of the maps themselves. Now, of course, they don't look as good. That obviously touches on the graphics that we just talked about. The new maps look just absolutely phenomenal. But on top of that, they also aren't as well fleshed out, I guess, as the current day maps, in terms of like there's no debris around the place and like things to use for cover. They were pretty empty and barren, and that's just how shooters were back in the day. It was simply to do with like the actual layout of the map, and very rarely did games back in those days have any sort of cover to hide behind outside of just the walls that you were playing within. So in more of an objective view, obviously current day games, and especially Battlefront 2017, for example, they do have better maps than the old games. But in terms of just purely the layout and I guess the footprint of the map, the bird's eye view that you can see of it, I do genuinely think that some of those maps are actually better than the current day maps. They were laid out really, really well. They were all very memorable. They all had really good like focal points, I guess you would say, and they were all very, I guess they just all had a very good flow compared to a lot of modern day shooters, for example. They don't really have that. Now, the only issue that I have with those older maps though is to do with the spawn points. The spawn points in the old Battlefront games were absolutely terrible. You would often spawn in someone's line of sight, you would often spawn like in a grenade and just blow up immediately, and there's nothing to do to like fix that or anything. Current day games, they often have like spawn protection and stuff, but back then you would often just spawn and immediately die. And on top of that, you would often spawn very far away, like the spawn points weren't laid out in a way where you were quickly back into the action. Sometimes the closest area you could spawn would be literally like a 2-minute run to get back to the fight. So in terms of the spawn points and stuff, they definitely were not as good on the old maps. But like I said, I am going to go to bat for the old school Battlefront games. They do genuinely, in my opinion, have some pretty solid maps, and some of them are absolute classics. Now, before we go any further, I'm actually giving away a copy of the Battlefront Classic Collection. I'm going to be doing it just a day or two before launch next week, and all you guys need to do to enter that giveaway is join the free tier to the Patreon. Yes, there is free Patreon, and joining up will automatically enter you into this giveaway. Now, paid tiers will give you double entry as well, so if you guys are already a paying member, or if you're interested in signing up, you will get double entry into the giveaway, obviously increasing your chances of winning, but you will automatically be entered regardless, even if you join at that free tier as well. Not only am I doing this giveaway, but eventually I will be giving away some of my own merch as well, and at some point throughout this year, I'm actually giving away a couple of lightsabers as well, and all of that will be done through the Patreon. So be sure to go and check it out. The link is at the top of the description. Click that link, click the button that says join for free, and you'll automatically be entered into all of those giveaways. The announcement for the winner will be done over there on the Patreon a day or two before launch. But with that being said, let's get stuck back into the video. Now, next on the list, we have got the classes, and there were actually some differences between the class systems in both of these games. Battlefront 2017 had the typical 4-class system that we've kind of come to know from Battlefield as well. In that game, we had the Assault, Heavy, Officer, and Specialist class. And then on top of that, there were also the reinforcements who were tied to kind of like era-specific content and maps. So for example, Death Troopers were only available on the original trilogy maps. And I guess the reinforcements did technically count as an extra class. They were unlocked through the battle point system though, so it is obviously a little bit different to how it was in the old games, but I thought I would mention that as well, because realistically we all know that there was the 4 main classes, but there were obviously the reinforcements and then the heroes on top of that as well. Now, in the old Battlefront 2, however, there were actually 6 classes in the game that were very slightly different between each faction, those being the standard infantry, which for example was just like a regular clone or stormtrooper. There was the assault trooper, the pilot or engineer, depending on the faction, the sniper or sharpshooter, and then there was also 2 different unique units as well. So for example, for the separatists, there would be a droidica and a magna guard, and again, it was just different depending on the faction, but overall they were essentially all the same, or at least very similar across each of those factions. Now, depending on the mode, sometimes those final 2 unique units, you did have to earn a certain amount of points to essentially unlock them, which essentially just resulted in you have to play as another class to kind of get some kills, and then you can spawn in as that class afterwards. So in a way, it was kind of similar to the reinforcement system in Battlefront 2017, but then there were also different modes where you could just spawn in as them straight away. So those were kind of the key differences between those 2 different class systems. Now, another key difference, which is probably the key difference really, is that obviously you don't get to choose your weapon in the old games, so you can only choose the class, which did have the weapons tied to it, and it was the same thing for the gadgets. So there were technically different weapons, and I guess technically you can choose your weapon, but you could only choose by the class. You couldn't actually go and change your weapon for the regular infantry, for example. You just had to pick a class and they had a set weapon, whereas obviously the 2017 one is a lot more fleshed out with the customization side of it. Both of them do have pros and cons. For example, I think that the 2017 version is a lot better, having more customization and, you know, being able to choose your weapons and stuff like that. But it was also probably a little bit more balanced in Battlefront 2005, in that if you pick X class, you just have X weapon, and everyone else who's playing is X class just has X weapon as well. So it's very hard to have sort of imbalances in that sense. With that being said, the game is definitely not balanced, and you guys will find that out very quickly if you haven't played already. There are some classes that are just absolutely insane. For example, droidicas are just absolutely cooked. If you get your shield up, you are not dying. So the game overall is not balanced, but I think the class system itself, funnily enough, is probably more balanced than it was in Battlefront 2017. Now, next on the list, we have got the heroes, and I'm going to read through every single hero across both games just so you guys can get a quick idea of who who is in the game and kind of see them compared to each other. Now for Battlefront 2005, going through the list in terms of the light side and then the dark side in each faction, for the Clone Wars era, we have Yoda, Ayla Secura, Mace Windu, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ki-Adi-Mundi, and then Kit Fisto, who was only available on the Xbox Live version of the game. Moving on to the original trilogy, there was then Yoda, Luke, Han Solo, Chewbacca, Princess Leia, and then Obi-Wan Kenobi once again. As for the dark side, when it comes to the Clone Wars era, there was Count Dooku, General Grievous, Jango Fett, Darth Maul, Darth Sidious, and then Ventress, who was once again only available through the Xbox Live version. And then in terms of the Empire, there was Darth Vader, Emperor Palpatine, Boba Fett, and then there was actually Anakin Skywalker, who essentially was just a dark side Anakin, so he still had his blue lightsaber and stuff, but he was obviously counted as a villain. Now, comparing that list to Battlefront 2017, in terms of the light side, we had Luke, Leia, Han, Chewie, Lando, Yoda, Rey, Finn, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and then BB-8. And then in terms of the dark side villains, we had Darth Vader, Emperor Palpatine, Boba Fett, Bosk, Iden Versio, Darth Maul, Kylo Ren, Captain Phasma, General Grievous, Count Dooku, and BB-9E. So comparing those lists in terms of the characters that we had in the original games that aren't in the new ones, those are Ayla Secura, Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, Kit Fisto, Jango Fett, Ventress, and I guess technically Darkside Anakin as well. Those are all unique to the old Battlefront 2. So for those of you guys who haven't played the original, those are all technically new characters you're going to be able to play as that you couldn't play as in Battlefront 2017. Now, obviously 2017 has more, and I think the main thing here is that they were way more fleshed out in the new games than they were in the old games. They all had their own sets of abilities and stuff like that. They all even had a lot of customization in terms of skins and all those sorts of things. So the hero system for me personally in 2017 was so much better. How it was in Battlefront 2005 is that there were lots of heroes that were actually identical other than the skins and the voice acting. So for example, Luke, Obi-Wan, and Mace Windu all have the exact same abilities. They have a force push and a saber throw, although to be fair, Windu did actually have a force slam that I don't think the others had. But yeah, a lot of them were pretty much identical to each other. They just looked different. And then on top of that, it goes without saying too, but there was no like star card system or anything like that. There was really no customization in the game at all compared to how it was in Battlefront 2017. So I definitely think the hero system in 2017 is like 10 times better, as you would expect with a newer game with 12 years of advancement in the gaming industry. The hardware is better, the systems in general and the mechanics these days are just better. But I will say the Clone Wars lineup for the old games was absolutely elite. So I'm very keen to play as some of those awesome characters again. Now, lastly, touching on the game modes, and this is another area where it is very, very different between each of the Battlefront 2 games. Going through the list of the game modes in the original Battlefront 2, the modes that were available were Conquest, Assault, Hero Assault, 2 Flag, Capture the Flag, as well as 1 Flag, Capture the Flag, and then there was also Hunt and the XL mode, which was essentially just a bigger version of Conquest. It is also worth keeping in mind that all of those were available both online and offline. And then on top of that as well, there was also Galactic Conquest, which is essentially a fan favorite mode from any video game ever, as well as there was the campaign for both games as well that we will be getting in the Classic Collection. So the 2004 campaign was essentially just some classic battles from episodes 1 through 6, and then 2005 had the Darth Vader's like elite 501st Legion of Stormtroopers, where we essentially just played as the 501st, and it told a bit of a story that way. So those were all of the modes that were available in the original Battlefront 2. As for the current day Battlefront 2 though, there was obviously a lot more. In terms of the multiplayer side of it, there was Supremacy that was obviously added later on in the game. There was then Heroes vs Villains, Hero Showdown, and then there was also Hero Starfighters that essentially 0 human beings ever played. And then on top of that, there were, I guess, like the core game modes in Galactic Assault, which for me is easily the best across any of the Battlefront games. This is the #1 game mode that you can ever have an experience in when it comes to a multiplayer Star Wars game. There was then Starfighter Assault, which was essentially the same thing but with starfighters. We then had Strike and Extraction. Both were in the same playlist, but they were obviously very different modes. And then there was Blast, Ewok Hunt, and Jetpack Cargo. They then later on added the co-op mode as well, which was essentially just you playing with a bunch of mates, and there was just some like mini objectives within that mode. In terms of the single player modes, there was then obviously the campaign, There was also instant action, which was essentially just offline supremacy. There was then just the regular arcade, which was kind of the original offline mode that was pretty basic, really. It didn't really have anything to it. And so that was pretty much it for the modes in the current day Battlefront 2. So obviously there's a lot more in the current Battlefront 2, as you would expect once again. And I do think the majority of them are probably better as well. Conquest is obviously a classic from the original Battlefront 2 and Battlefront 2004 for that matter. But yeah, I definitely think that the modes in 2017 were a fair bit better. So that's something you guys should expect. If you haven't played the games in terms of the originals, then yeah, don't expect anything crazy in terms of the game modes. They were all pretty stock standard, to say the least. So really, those are all of the key differences and similarities between the classic Battlefront 2 and the new one. I'm very excited to play this game again, and I will be streaming it the day that it goes live. So be sure to turn on your notifications so you don't miss out. There is also going to be plenty more content coming up after the game is out as well, so be sure to keep your eyes peeled. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and may the force be with you always.